Well, let's jump right into it. Ukraine and Russia. Peace talks scheduled in Saudi Arabia next Monday with Ukraine and U.S. officials on one side and, separate discussions, the Kremlin confirmed, with U.S. and Russian counterparts happening at the same time.
Interesting choice of venue, wouldn't you say? Saudi Arabia stepping up as a mediator?
Right. Definitely raises eyebrows. But hey, any chance for diplomacy, right? Zelensky, though, seems pretty firm on some things going into these talks. He's urging Russia to drop their demands about cutting off military aid to Ukraine. And he basically said nixing NATO membership is a non-starter, call it a big gift to Russia.
Understandable from Ukraine's perspective, I'd say. They're fighting for their survival and want to secure their future. But that NATO issue, a huge sticking point for Russia, a roadblock for sure.
Big time. And then there's the talk about Ukraine's nuclear power plants. Zelensky denied those reports about him and Trump discussing ceding them to the U.S., said those plants belong to Ukrainians. Though he did say he'd be open to the U.S. maybe taking control of Zaporizhia, if they could wrestle it from Russia for investment or modernization.
Interesting. So asserting ownership, but also pragmatic about potential help, especially for something currently under Russian control.
Exactly. And on Crimea, no wiggle room. Zelensky called it an integral part of Ukraine. No territorial concessions there. And he said any ceasefire, first stage, has to include both land and sea.
Drawing a line in the sand there, showing where Ukraine stands, what's non-negotiable for them.
Absolutely. But here's where things get a little murky, right? Some conflicting reports about the whole de-escalation thing. It was mentioned Trump, back in the day, got Putin to agree to stop those airstrikes on Ukraine's energy grid. But Zelensky says those strikes haven't stopped.
Well, that doesn't exactly inspire confidence, does it?
Nope. And Russia's deputy foreign minister, Grushko, he's sticking to their guns, said Moscow wants guarantees. Ukraine stays neutral, out of NATO. That's their bottom line for any agreement. And meanwhile, our own Defense Secretary Hegseth, he's basically saying, don't count on Ukraine joining NATO anytime soon, even as part of a settlement.
Interesting. So we're seeing those different perspectives within the U.S. administration and obviously big gaps between what the negotiating parties want. Makes you wonder how they'll bridge that.
It does, doesn't it? And all this while the fighting, tragically, continues. Overnight strikes in Ukraine, casualties reported. And then you have Ukrainian drones. They apparently hit a Russian airfield, set it on fire, 10 injuries reported. And to add to it all, Zelensky is asking the EU for 5 billion euros for artillery shells, to keep the pressure on Russia.
Right. So we're hearing about these agreements, but then you see the reality on the ground. Fragile. That's the word that comes to mind. This whole de-escalation thing feels very fragile.
Yeah, I'd say so too. Oh, and one more thing on Ukraine. The White House. They actually paused military aid briefly, apparently some kind of dispute. Yeah. But they've restarted it now, and they're backing this proposed 30-day ceasefire.
The politics of it all, right? Shows you how even internal disagreements can affect the support Ukraine gets.
For sure. And across the pond, UK Prime Minister Starmer, he's really pushing for strong security measures. If a peace deal does happen, he wants it to stick. Talking about a coalition of the willing to make sure it does. He even said the UK is moving from, political momentum to actual military planning for this.
So, thinking ahead about enforcement, not just words on paper, because any agreement, it's got to have teeth if it's going to last.
Exactly. All right, let's shift gears a bit. Head over to the Middle East. Hamas, they've fired rockets at Tel Aviv. First time since Israel restarted their ground operation in Gaza.
A sign they're not backing down, despite the Israeli offensive.
Yeah, seems that way. Israel says they intercepted one of those rockets. Others landed in areas where, thankfully, there weren't any people. But the situation in Gaza, it's just devastating. The Hamas-run health ministry there, they're reporting at least 591 Palestinians dead, and over 200 of them are children. This is just since Tuesday.
Those numbers, it's heartbreaking, the human cost of this conflict.
It is. The IDF confirmed they've got a ground operation going on in Rafah, and they're also active in the north and central parts of Gaza, doing what they call targeted ground activities to create a buffer of sorts. They're calling it the Netzarim Corridor.
So expanding their operations on the ground?
Yeah, and the Israeli government's pointing the finger squarely at Hamas. Yeah. Saying it's their fault, things escalated because they rejected those hostage deals.
Right, the hostage situation, another layer of complexity in this already very difficult situation.
Absolutely. Israel says 59 hostages are still being held. 24 of them, they believe, are still alive. And tragically, 5 UNRWA staff members have been killed in recent days.
A stark reminder of the dangers for civilians and aid workers, even those working under the banner of the UN.
Yeah, the UN's actually investigating damage to their compound in Gaza. calling it, and this is a quote, not an accident.
Sounds like they suspect something deliberate happened there.
They do, though the Gaza Health Ministry blames Israel, who of course denies it. On the international front, the U.S. has reaffirmed its commitment to international law when it comes to supplying weapons to Israel, and the White House is standing by Israel's actions.
So the usual alliance is holding strong, despite the escalating situation and the mounting casualties.
Yeah, and there are casualties on the international side, too. A British bomb disposal expert was injured earlier, and in that UN compound attack, a UK national was also hurt.
Shows you how quickly things can spill over, how this conflict can affect people beyond the immediate region.
It does, and we're getting these really grim accounts from Nasser Hospital in Gaza talking about the dire conditions there, the high number of casualties. Meanwhile, in Israel, thousands have taken to the streets in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, demanding the government bring those hostages home.
Understandable. The families, they just want their loved ones back. It's got to be agonizing not knowing, and feeling like the government isn't doing enough.
I can only imagine. And adding to the tension, Yemen's Houthis, they actually fired a ballistic missile at Ben Gurion Airport. Thankfully, it was intercepted.
Wow, that's a whole other dimension. Shows the potential for this conflict to draw in other regional players.
Yeah, it's a very volatile situation, no doubt. And Netanyahu, he's not sounding very hopeful about peace talks right now. He said combat has resumed, quote, in full force, and ceasefire talks are under fire.
Seems like a very difficult path to peace at the moment.
It does. You know, hostage families in Israel, they're accusing the government of abandoning their loved ones, which adds even more pressure. Remember, those ceasefire extension talks, they fell apart after the initial phase expired back on March 1st. And Israel blocked supplies to Gaza that same month, claiming Hamas was taking them, but no evidence was provided to support that.
So a breakdown in trust, accusations flying back and forth, it's a recipe for continued conflict.
It is, and it's important to remember how this all started. It goes back to that Hamas attack on October 7th, 2023. 1,200 people killed, 251 hostages taken. And since then, according to the Hamas-run health ministry, Israel's offensive has killed over 48,500 Palestinians.
Tragic numbers. A stark reminder of the long shadow this conflict casts and the enduring cycle of violence it perpetuates.
Absolutely. Now let's turn our attention back to the U.S. Big news on the domestic front. President Trump has signed an executive order, and it's a big one. He's starting the process of dismantling the Department of Education.
Wow, that's a huge move. Definitely a shakeup of the educational landscape.
Yeah, no kidding.
Yeah.
When he announced the order, Trump said he wants to shut it down as quickly as possible, saying it's doing us no good.
Strong words.
Definitely. Now, to be fair, he did acknowledge that to completely shut it down, he needs Congress to sign off on it. And with the Senate the way it is right now, that's not very likely.
Right. So lots of hurdles to overcome. Not a done deal by any stretch.
Not at all. And there's already talk of legal challenges to this order, so it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Trump, though, he's making his case. He's arguing that the U.S. spends a ton on education, but we don't get the results to show for it. Says we rank low in terms of success.
That's a common critique, and one that resonates with a lot of people. Whether or not dismantling the department is the answer, though, is a whole other debate.
Right, right. And so, for now, the administration's plan is to cut whatever they can legally cut. Trump, by the way, had some nice words for Linda McMahon, the current secretary. Said he hopes she's the last one, and hinted she might get a different role.
Interesting. Sounds like he's got other plans for her, maybe somewhere else in the administration.
Maybe. And Senator Cassidy, he's jumping on board too. He's planning to introduce legislation to actually close down the department, though it's probably not going to go anywhere. A lot of people are comparing this to what happened with USA, those funding cuts and how programs got disrupted.
Right. So the concern is, what are the unintended consequences of such a drastic move?
Exactly. Now, the order itself, it directs McMahon to, facilitate the closure, basically shift authority over to state and local levels, but also make sure things keep running smoothly. No interruptions in services.
Big task, right. Shutting things down, shifting responsibility, all while keeping everything going.
For sure. So people are asking, what does the Department of Education actually do? Well, it was created back in 1979. It's in charge of funding student loans, those programs for low-income families. But Trump, he's accused them of indoctrinating young people with all this stuff about race, sexuality, politics.
The culture war argument. We hear that a lot these days, don't we?
We do. And it's important to point out, just for clarity, that the federal government, they don't run the schools, they don't set the curriculum. That's all handled at the state and local level.
Right, so the question is, how much influence does the Department of Education actually have on those things? And is that influence good or bad?
Right. And it's also worth noting that federal funding only makes up about 13% of what primary and secondary schools get. But the department does play a big role in those federal student loans, so that's something to consider.
Yeah, that's a huge factor for a lot of people trying to navigate the cost of education.
Absolutely. McMahon, she actually sent a memo to staff titled, "Our Department's Final Mission," so pretty clear message there. Some people are speculating that certain programs might get moved to other departments, like Treasury, for example.
So a reshuffling of the deck, potentially.
Yeah, Republicans, unsurprisingly, are accusing the department of pushing a woke agenda, while the teachers union, the AFT, they're criticizing Trump's plans.
Sounds like the usual suspects taking their usual positions.
Pretty much.
Hmm.
And of course, most kids in the U.S., they go to those free public schools, which are funded and run locally, with the states having some say too. And the curriculum, same thing. Mostly decided at the local and state level. This whole thing about getting rid of the Department of Education, it's not new, by the way. Reagan tried it too.
History repeating itself.
Maybe. And it's worth noting, the Department of Education, it's actually the smallest cabinet agency. Only about 4,400 employees, and their budget is less than 2% of the whole federal budget.
So not exactly a behemoth in terms of size and spending.
Nope. And they're actually being affected by those workforce cuts that Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency is doing, that whole push to cut spending. So retirements, layoffs, people taking leave, it's all happening there.
So even before any potential dismantling, the department's already shrinking.
That's right. And those layoffs, they're supposed to hit about 2,100 people starting March 21st.
Significant number.
Yeah. And that's all part of DOGE's, efforts to restructure things. All right, let's zoom back out to the international scene. Turkey, things are getting pretty tense there. They've arrested a whole bunch of people, dozens over online posts, and it's all tied to this detention of the Istanbul mayor, Ekrem İmamoğlu.
İmamoğlu, a key figure in Turkish politics and a potential thorn in Erdogan's side.
Exactly. He was detained, along with over 100 others, on charges of corruption and aiding terrorism, no less. He's from the opposition party, the CHP, and many see him as a real contender against Erdogan in the 2028 elections.
So this arrest, it's not just about alleged crimes, it's got major political implications.
Big time. Critics are calling it a coup, no less. And there were protests planned, though the governor put a stop to that pretty quickly.
Clampdown, classic authoritarian tactic.
Yeah. The interior minister, he said they'd identified over 260 suspect account managers online, accused of posting stuff that was provocative, inciting hatred and crime. 37 of them were arrested. And get this, they say there have been over 18.6 million online posts about these arrests.
Wow, so a huge online reaction. People are definitely paying attention.
For sure. İmamoğlu, even though he's detained, his X account is still active. Yeah. It's urging people to stand up against evil, and it's calling on the judiciary and Erdogan's party to fight injustice.
So even in detention, he's still a voice of opposition, a rallying point.
He is. And the municipality, it's still controlled by his party, the CHP, and they're even playing his speeches in the metro.
Clever, keeping his presence alive, reminding people he's still there.
Right. There were some small student protests, people chanting opposition slogans, and İmamoğlu's office called for another round of protests.
Pushing back against the government's crackdown.
Exactly. The CHP leader, Özal, he's urging supporters to fill the streets.
Sounds like they're not going to go quietly.
Nope. Erdogan, meanwhile, he's brushing all this off, saying the CHP's problems are their own, not the country's concern.
Dismissive, as usual.
Yeah. But these arrests, they're part of a larger pattern, right?
Yeah.
We've seen this crackdown on opposition figures, journalists, even entertainers recently. The opposition, they're saying this is all politically motivated, of course, but the Justice Ministry, they're saying the judiciary is independent, nothing shady going on.
Right, the classic lines. But the timing of this, it's awfully suspicious, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, İmamoğlu, he won re-election as mayor just last year, and the CHP, they swept those local elections. It was a real blow to Erdogan, who was also a former Istanbul mayor himself.
So this arrest, it happens right after Erdogan's party suffers some electoral losses, and right before the CHP is supposed to choose their presidential candidate.
And who's the sole candidate? İmamoğlu. The CHP, they're even planning a symbolic election, for people to show their support for him.
Smart move, keeps him in the spotlight, turns this detention into a rallying cry.
Exactly. Erdogan, he's been in power for 22 years now,
Ugh.
but he's term limited in 2028 unless they change the constitution.
So a lot at stake, and Imamoglu represents a real challenge to his grip on power.
Some news out of Canada now. Their Foreign Minister Jolie confirmed China executed 4 Canadians.
Oh, wow. That's major. Drug crimes, right?
Yeah, they were all dual citizens, but China doesn't recognize that, of course.
Mm-hmm.
Their identities haven't been released.
Not surprising. China tends to be very secretive about these things.
They do, and they're already pushing back against Canada, urging them to stop making irresponsible remarks.
Yeah.
They're saying they acted in accordance with the law, that they had solid and sufficient evidence, and that the rights of those individuals were fully guaranteed.
The standard line. China emphasizing its judicial sovereignty, not wanting any outside interference.
Exactly. They also reminded Canada that they don't recognize dual citizenship. And, they've got that very tough stance on drug offenses. Now, executions of foreigners are pretty rare in China, but they do happen.
And this is going to further complicate the relationship between Canada and China, which is already quite strained.
Oh, for sure. Canada has been following these cases closely, and Trudeau and others had actually tried to stop these executions. They've repeatedly called for clemency, and they've made it very clear that they're against the death penalty.
2 very different systems, 2 very different approaches to justice, and a major diplomatic headache for Canada.
Absolutely. China, they impose the death penalty for a whole range of serious crimes. The exact number of executions they carry out, it's a state secret, but it's believed to be very high. Amnesty International Canada, they condemn the executions, of course. In this case, it reminds me of what happened back in 2019. Remember Robert Lloyd Schellenberg?
Vaguely.
He's a Canadian sentenced to death for drug smuggling. Not one of the 4 executed now, though. But it shows how serious China is about these offenses. And relations between the 2 countries, well, they've been icy ever since Canada detained that Huawei executive, Meng Wanzhou, back in 2018. China retaliated by arresting 2 Canadians, who have since been released. Then in 2023, there were those reports about China interfering in Canadian elections, which, of course, China denied.
So a history of tension, mistrust, and now this. Not a good time for Canada-China relations.
Not at all. And just recently, China slapped retaliatory tariffs on Canadian farm and food imports after Canada put tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, steel, and aluminum.
A tit-for-tat trade war. Another sign of deteriorating relations.
Yeah, exactly. Turning to a very somber story now. Thousands of people in North Macedonia are mourning those who died in that horrific nightclub fire in Kokani. 59 people lost their lives. Funerals are being held across the country, and there was this very sad procession in Kokani.
Just awful. A tragedy that's touched so many lives.
It is, and as more details come out, it's just fueling the anger. Turns out the club, it allegedly didn't even have a license, no sprinklers, and get this, the only emergency exit was locked.
Unbelievable. Talk about negligence.
I know. Over 20 people have been detained so far. Officials, police officers, even the club manager. People want answers, and they want someone held accountable.
Rightfully so. It seems like a lot of corners were cut, safety was ignored.
Yeah, and there's this growing feeling that corruption played a role, that officials looked the other way, allowing this unsafe place to operate.
Which, sadly, isn't uncommon in many parts of the world.
Unfortunately not. And that anger, it's boiling over. We've seen protests against corruption, people vandalizing a pub, even the mayor's office in Kokani.
People taking their frustrations to the streets.
They are. And now the government's scrambling, doing inspections of all these cafes and nightclubs, looking for safety violations.
Closing the barn door after the horse has bolted, as they say?
Yeah, too little, too late for those 59 victims. All of them have been identified, most of them teenagers, young people just starting their lives. And in Skopje, about 1,000 people attended the funeral of Andrei Gorgijski. He was a singer with the band DNK.
A whole generation wiped out. Just unimaginable.
It is. The fire spread so quickly because the ceiling, it was made of flammable material. And get this, there were about 500 people inside. The capacity was only 250.
Packed like sardines. No wonder it was so hard for people to escape.
Exactly. The interior minister, he's already saying he suspects bribery, corruption allowed this to happen. And it wasn't just the deaths. Over 160 people were injured. 45 of them seriously enough that they had to be transferred to hospitals in Bulgaria, Greece, Serbia, and Turkey.
A tragedy with a ripple effect, reaching far beyond North Macedonia's borders.
Absolutely. Yeah. Now, for a story that thankfully offers some closure, even after all these years, fingerprints have finally identified a woman who was found dead in Spain 7 years ago.
7 years? That's a long time for a family to wonder.
I know. Her name was Ainhoa Izaga Ibieta Lima. She was 33 years old, from Paraguay. And they were able to identify her thanks to Interpol's Operation Identify Me.
I've heard of that. They use public black notices to try and identify people who've died and haven't been identified.
That's right. And this is actually the second successful identification they've made through this campaign. So back in August 2018, Lima's body was found in this poultry shed in Girona province, Spain. No ID on her. Nobody in the area knew who she was. All they had was this tattoo. It said success in Hebrew.
A mystery.
It was. And so they added her case to Operation Identify Me. And then finally a breakthrough. The Paraguayan authorities, they managed to match her fingerprints.
Amazing after all this time.
It is. Turns out her brother, he'd actually reported her missing back in 2019. He'd last spoken to her in 2013 when she said she was going to Spain.
So she'd been gone for years before they even knew something had happened.
Yeah, heartbreaking. Now, the circumstances of her death are still unexplained, but at least now her family has some answers.
Closure. It might not be everything, but it's something.
It is. The first person identified through Operation Identify Me, her name was Rita Roberts, from the UK.
Yeah.
They identified her from a tattoo that was shown in a news report.
Wow, so even media coverage can help crack these cases.
It can. And this campaign, it's still going. They're trying to identify 45 more women who were found dead in Europe. Most of them were murder victims between the ages of 15 and 30.
Such a sad reality. And with so much migration, human trafficking these days, it makes these identifications even harder.
Absolutely. If anyone's interested, they can actually find details and photos of these cases on Interpol's website.
Might be worth a look. You never know. You might have information that could help.
You never know. All right, time for a little foodie news now. The world's oldest Michelin-starred restaurant. It's called Georges Blanc. It's in Vaugnasse, France. Well, it's just lost one of its stars. It used to have 3, now it's down to 2.
Oh, wow. That's a big deal in the culinary world. Those Michelin stars, they're like gold.
They are. The chef, Georges Blanc himself, he's 82 years old now, and he said he wasn't expecting it. He's actually planning to make the restaurant less elitist, more accessible.
Interesting. Maybe a response to the changing times, the evolving tastes of diners.
Could be. This restaurant, it's got a long history. It first got a Michelin star way back in 1929, and it's held on to at least 1 star ever since. Georges Blanc, he took over in 1964 and earned them that 3rd star in 1981.
So a real institution. Losing a star, that's got to sting.
It must.
Yeah.
But the director of the Michelin Guide, Gwendol Polinek, he said it just reflects the evolution of quality. And he praised Blanc for, creating this whole gourmet village in Vaugnasse. He also said the guide will continue to assess restaurants with kindness, rigor.
So diplomatic, but also firm. The Michelin Guide, they've built their reputation on their standards.
They have. And besides the restaurant, Blanc also owns several other businesses, hotels, food shops, even an inn.
So a mini culinary empire built around that restaurant.
It is. And for context of the Michelin Guide, it's been around since 1900, and they started that star system in 1926. It was initially meant to encourage people to drive more. The annual star ceremony, by the way, it's happening at the end of the month.
So stay tuned for more culinary drama.
Definitely. Now let's head over to Canada. Word on the street is that Prime Minister Mark Carney is about to call a snap election. Could be as soon as this Sunday.
A snap election? What's prompting that?
Well, Carney, he's the Liberal leader, took over from Trudeau, remember? And it looks like he's planning to make this all about his ability to deal with the U.S. trade war, the whole thing with Trump and those tariffs.
Smart move. Playing to his strengths, capitalizing on a hot-button issue.
Exactly. So how this works is the PM requests the dissolution of Parliament, and boom, 5-week campaign election day. And the focus, everyone's saying it's going to be all about that trade dispute with the U.S.
High-stakes stuff. And with those tariffs looming, it's definitely going to be on voters' minds.
Absolutely. Carney, he's already promised that he'll keep those retaliatory tariffs on goods that aren't covered by the CUSMA, that trade agreement between Canada, the U.S., and Mexico. He's basically saying, if Trump keeps playing hardball, so will he.
Tough talk, but can he back it up?
That's the question. And he's already threatened those sweeping tariffs supposed to kick in on April 2nd, on top of the ones they already have on steel and aluminum.
So yeah, the pressure's on for Carney to deliver.
It is. The main contenders in this election, it'll likely be Carney versus the conservative leader, Poilievre.
Poilievre, he's been pretty vocal in his criticism of the Liberals' handling of the trade dispute, right?
He has. But the polls, they're showing a much tighter race than before all this tariff talk started. Before that, the conservatives were ahead by like 20 points.
So the trade war, it's shaken things up, made it a much closer contest.
For sure. And of course, you also have the Bloc Québécois and the New Democrats, the NDP. They're in the mix too.
Right. Always a multi-party race in Canada. Makes it interesting to watch.
It does. Now let's move on to Guatemala. President Arevalo there, he had to backtrack on this plan for compulsory car insurance.
Compulsory car insurance, what was the problem with that?
Well, it was supposed to cover cars, trucks, buses, motorcycles, the whole shebang. The idea was to make sure that if there's an accident, there's money to compensate victims.
Makes sense on the surface.
It does, but the problem was a lot of people, especially those struggling financially, they just couldn't afford it. Guatemala's got a high poverty rate, about 55%.
So a well-intentioned policy, but one that would have hit the poorest the hardest.
Exactly. And the public. They weren't having it. They took to the streets, thousands of them, blocking roads, clashing with police. Some of the protests got pretty violent.
Public anger, loud and clear.
It was. This whole thing was sparked by a deadly bus accident last month. Over 50 people died.
So the government was trying to react, trying to prevent another tragedy. But they went about it the wrong way.
It seems that way. Arevalo, he was elected on this platform of making necessary changes, even if they're tough. And he said he still believes in this new general transport law they're working on. But after talking with the protesters, they've agreed to set up a technical committee to figure out how to implement this compulsory insurance within a year.
So a compromise. Buying some time, trying to find a solution that works for everyone.
Yeah, the protesters, they were worried about the cost, how much it would all end up costing them. Nobody really knew. And that uncertainty fueled a lot of the anger.
Makes sense.
Those blockades, by the way, they completely paralyzed parts of the capital. Schools and businesses had to shut down.
Disruption, that's often what it takes for governments to listen.
It often is. And now for something a little more uplifting. Finland has been named the happiest country in the world. Again, for the 8th year in a row.
Those Finns, they've got it figured out.
They do.
Yeah.
And the report cited their access to nature, all those forests and lakes, and their strong welfare system.
So social safety nets, natural beauty, sounds like a good recipe for happiness.
It does, doesn't it? And right behind Finland, all the other Nordic countries.
Must be something in the Scandinavian water.
Right. And guess who made it into the top 10 for the first time? Costa Rica and Mexico.
Interesting. So it's not just about wealth or development. There are other factors at play.
Definitely. Now, on the flip side, the UK and the US, they actually dropped to their lowest positions ever in this ranking. 23rd and 24th.
Not a good look for the Anglosphere.
Not really. But here's a fun little tidbit from this report. A study found that strangers are actually twice as kind as we perceive them to be. They did this experiment where they dropped wallets and tracked how many were returned.
Interesting. So we underestimate the good in people.
Seems like it. And the report, it actually linked belief in kindness to higher levels of happiness. Makes sense, right?
Does this? Maybe we should all focus on being a little kinder.
Couldn't hurt. This report, by the way, it's called the World Happiness Report, and it's put